I thought I was buying a quiet lakeside escape, a place to finally breathe. But I never expected the HOA to turn my dream into a nightmare. One morning, I woke up to see 23 cabins rising on my private island, built without my permission. While they claimed it was within the rules, every inch of my sanctuary was being swallowed by someone else's agenda, and there was nothing I could do. Or so they thought. I had to choose, stay silent or fight back in a way no one could imagine. How far would I go to take back what's mine? Life on the lake had always been quiet, almost idyllic. The morning smelled of pine and fresh water, and sunlight danced across the rippling surface as my small family sipped coffee on the dock. We weren't wealthy, just ordinary people seeking a peaceful escape from the city's chaos. Weekends were for fishing, kayaking, and barbecues with neighbors who waved politely as they passed. The island felt like our own little world, a place where laughter echoed across the water and worries seemed distant. I spent hours tending to the garden, painting the cabin's weathered siding and imagining the years of memories we'd create. Evenings were filled with the gentle hum of insects, the call of loons, and the satisfaction of work well done. It was simple, it was serene, and I thought it was safe, but behind the polished smiles and neatly trimmed lawns, the HOA loomed quietly, like a shadow we hadn't noticed. Rules were whispered at neighborhood meetings, guidelines about structures, permits, and community aesthetics that seemed harmless at first. Some neighbors mentioned it offhandedly, warning me that the HOA could be strict, but I never expected how far it would go. There was a tension brewing, subtle yet persistent, that hinted at the coming storm. Little did I know, the peace of my island home was about to be shattered, and the serene world I had built would become the stage for a conflict I never saw coming at first. The HOA's rules seemed like background noise letters tucked into the mailbox. Polite notices about permits, minor requests about landscaping, and a reminder that community aesthetics mattered. I tried to follow them, eager to stay under the radar, but the small nudges quickly became sharp prods. One morning, I found a letter pinned to my cabin door, official-looking and bold. A fine for unauthorized structures. Unauthorized structures. I had built nothing new, only repaired the old dock, which had rotted over the winter. The fine was steep, a few $100s. But what stung was the tone, accusatory, almost mocking. Then came the next intrusion. The HOA sent inspectors unannounced, walking across my property with clipboards, taking photos, asking questions about compliance and neighbor complaints. I felt a rising anger. Mingled with disbelief, how could they enter my private island without my permission? When I confronted one officer politely, I was told they had community oversight rights. It sounded sinister, almost Orwellian. My sanctuary was shrinking with each passing week, and the subtle harassment grew more aggressive. Neighbors I had known for years began mentioning rules in passing, with the kind of casual cruelty that made my blood boil. "You know how strict the HOA is," one said, smiling faintly as if to comfort me, but their eyes held a gleam of satisfaction. It wasn't advice, it was warning. Then, in a shocking twist, I discovered that the HOA had approved the construction of multiple cabins, 23 in total, on the neighboring parcels, closest to my property. I watched, helpless, as the forested edge of my private island began to transform into a crowded cluster of rented lake cabins. It was deliberate, almost theatrical. The tension became unbearable when a notice arrived declaring the cabins fully authorized and compliant, citing rules I had never seen, rules buried in obscure documents that seemed written to confuse ordinary homeowners. I felt trapped between legality and injustice, a sense of helplessness gnawing at me. Every walk to the dock, every glance at the water, reminded me that my solitude was being invaded, not by nature, but by bureaucracy and carefully wielded power. Yet even as frustration boiled, a determination grew. I started documenting every interaction, every letter, every uninvited inspection, and every construction milestone. Photos, dates, snippets of conversations, anything that could serve as proof. The sense of helplessness was being replaced by a plan. I realized that the HOA had assumed I would stay passive, intimidated into silence. But patience and meticulous preparation were about to become my weapons. Then came a turning point. One morning, I saw workers marking the trees for yet another cabin. My heart raced. My hands trembled with a mix of fury and fear. If I didn't act soon, the last remnants of my island's privacy would vanish. I contacted a lawyer specializing in property disputes. As I prepared for the legal battle, the HOA escalated further. Notices arrived at odd hours, threatening fines for lawn care, dock maintenance, and even excessive noise, though I had not made a sound beyond the occasional kayak splash. I felt constantly watched, a prisoner in what should have been my sanctuary. Each letter arrived like a small grenade, threatening my peace and testing my patience. One particularly cruel notice claimed that a neighbor had lodged a complaint. Because my garden gnome violated community aesthetics, I stared at the absurdity. Anger mounting, but also a strange clarity forming, the more ridiculous their attacks. The more I realized the fight wasn't about rules, it was about intimidation. At night, lying awake, I imagined every possible scenario. Could I confront the builders directly? Could I find loopholes in obscure HOA codes? Could I force the HOA to admit wrongdoing without a drawn-out legal war? Sleep became impossible. Each creak of the floorboards, each splash from the lake, reminded me that the conflict was closing in. My island, once a haven, had become a stage for a high-stakes power struggle. Then came the day that truly tested my resolve. I arrived at the dock to find surveyors taking precise measurements for yet another cabin. Their calm professionalism only heightened my frustration. They were just doing their job, and I had no legal barrier to stop them. But that very observation gave me an idea. The HOA was relying on assumptions that I would be intimidated, that I would comply silently, that I would accept their authority unquestioned. If I could challenge those assumptions, I could turn the game in my favor. And so I began to plan carefully, mapping out every interaction, every document, every witness who could confirm what had been happening, every unfair notice, every violation claim. Every intrusion became a piece of a puzzle that I would assemble for the ultimate confrontation. But even as the plan took shape, the emotional toll was immense. Anger, anxiety, and determination collided, leaving me exhausted yet resolute. Each cabin built on the island was a reminder. The clock was ticking, and if I didn't act decisively, I could lose everything as the sun set behind the newly constructed cabins. Casting long shadows across the water, I realized the fight was no longer hypothetical. The HOA had crossed an invisible line, and I knew that the calm facade of community rules was about to crumble under the weight of legal action and personal resolve. Every step I took from that moment onward would be a test of patience, strategy, and courage. And deep down, I understood that when the first court papers were filed, nothing would ever be the same. The stage was set. The HOA had revealed its hand, and now every move I made could decide the fate of my private island. But I still had one question burning in my mind. Could one determined homeowner truly stand up to the machinery of control and win? The day of the confrontation arrived like a storm rolling over the lake. I had spent weeks preparing every detail, every document, every scrap of evidence stacked neatly, ready to expose the HOA's relentless harassment. My heart pounded as I stepped onto the dock, the early morning mist clinging to the water like a shroud. The cabins loomed nearby, 23 of them, each one a monument to bureaucracy run amok. I could hear the faint hum of machinery, the last touches being put on a structure that should never have been allowed to exist. Inside the meeting room, tension was already thick. The HOA board members sat behind polished oak. Papers in hand, faces carefully neutral, but their eyes glittered with expectation. They thought I would be intimidated, that I would stumble, that their rules and fines had finally won. But I was ready. Every letter, every notice, every inspection report had been meticulously logged, cataloged, and double-checked. I had become a walking archive of their misdeeds. And now, the moment of reckoning had come. I laid the first document on the table. The permit approvals that had been buried in obscure filings. Never properly communicated, yet cited as justification for the cabins. I traced the signatures of board members, some of whom had clearly ignored protocol. Then came the bombshell. I revealed a deed, carefully researched and legally verified, proving that a portion of the land the HOA had claimed jurisdiction over was, in fact, privately owned by me. Not leased, not community space, but my property land they had no right to develop. As I placed it in front of the board, the room seemed to tilt. You could feel the air shift. The power dynamics, so heavily stacked in their favor, suddenly wavered. I could see panic flash behind the composed facades of the HOA officers. Every objection they raised was dismantled piece by piece. Letters claiming violations, documented and disproven. Fines, paid and recorded, with dates proving overreach. Unannounced inspections, logged with timestamps, revealing clear procedural violations. As I spoke, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The fear that one misstep could unravel everything, and the exhilaration of finally confronting years of unfair treatment head-on. One board member tried to interrupt, attempting to invoke some obscure clause buried in a handbook I had studied tirelessly. I countered immediately, quoting the exact legal language, showing where it directly contradicted their actions. Each rebuttal landed like a hammer, echoing through the room. I could see the subtle shifting of weight, the tightening of hands, the avoidance of eye contact. They were cornered, and they knew it. The tension reached a crescendo when I asked a simple, pointed question. Do you still claim authority over the private land of this island? Despite the deed and every documented misstep. The silence that followed was deafening. Some fidgeted, some scribbled notes, but no one dared speak. I could feel my own pulse in my ears, a rhythmic drumbeat of anticipation and defiance. I had transformed from a beleaguered homeowner into a force they could no longer ignore, then the final twist to the public revelation that would cement my victory. I had secretly recorded multiple meetings, phone calls, and email exchanges, all proving that the HOA had knowingly misrepresented facts, ignored procedures, and intentionally escalated tensions to intimidate residents. As the recordings played, faces turned pale. Every lie, every manipulation, every abuse of power was laid bare. The board members could no longer hide behind authority. Their credibility evaporated in real time. I watched as their confident, polished veneer cracked. Some tried to recover, arguing technicalities, but the evidence was irrefutable. Even the lawyer representing the HOA looked momentarily stunned, flipping through files frantically. It was a surreal moment, watching the institution that had made my life miserable unravel before me. The frustration, anxiety, and helplessness that had haunted me for months transformed into a raw, almost tangible vindication. Yet, even in victory, I kept my composure. The room was tense, everyone aware that the outcome was shifting dramatically, but I maintained calm, deliberate pacing. I reminded the board that this wasn't just about fines or cabins, it was about fairness, accountability, and respect for private property. I emphasized that power without responsibility leads to chaos, and that no rules, however well-intentioned, justify harassment. The most shocking moment came when the HOA chair, usually imperious and smug, finally slumped back in their chair. A reluctant acknowledgement of defeat. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the energy in the room shifted completely. I had turned the tables without a single act of aggression, unwavering persistence, and the courage to expose the truth. As I left the room, documents in hand, I glanced back at the cabins visible through the windows. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control returning. My sanctuary, though temporarily marred by the presence of the cabins, was legally untouchable. The emotional weight lifted slightly, replaced with a potent mix of relief, triumph, and exhaustion. I had faced the peak of the HOA's abuse and emerged not just unscathed, but victorious. But the story wasn't over. The aftermath, the final reckoning, and the long-term consequences were still to come. The dust settled slowly, almost imperceptibly, like morning fog lifting off the lake. In the weeks following the confrontation, the HOA seemed smaller, diminished, as if their power had leaked out of the room during that final meeting. Word spread through the community quickly. The homeowner who had been quietly subjected to harassment, fines, and relentless bureaucracy had not only survived but had turned the tables. Friends and neighbors whispered, some in admiration, others in disbelief. My island, my home, had become a symbol not of conflict, but of the strength that comes from standing up to unfair authority. The cabins remained for a while, still looming over the edge of my property, a stark reminder of what had been attempted. Yet their presence no longer carried the weight of fear or intimidation. The legal confirmation of my deed meant that the HOA could not touch my land, could not claim jurisdiction, could not enforce arbitrary fines. Every morning I stepped onto the dock, I felt a quiet vindication. The peace I had longed for was returning, albeit slowly. Because the battle had taken its toll not just on my nerves, but on the rhythm of daily life. Neighbors who had once eyed me with curiosity or mild suspicion began to approach differently. Some apologized quietly for having assumed the HOA's version of truth was correct. Others came forward with their own stories of petty fines, arbitrary inspections, and harassment, emboldened by my willingness to speak and act. It was both gratifying and sobering to realize how widespread the problem had been. My fight was never just about cabins. It had become a microcosm of a much larger struggle for fairness and accountability within the community. The HOA itself underwent subtle but significant changes. Board members who had orchestrated the harassment faced scrutiny, both legal and social. Meetings that were once dominated by opaque rules and condescending authority suddenly felt more transparent. The community began to question decisions rather than accept them blindly. It was remarkable to witness an institution designed to control had inadvertently fostered a culture of vigilance and accountability among the very people it had sought to dominate. I, too, experienced a transformation. The months of tension, sleepless nights, and relentless preparation had honed a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. Every inspection, every fine, every letter had forced me to act methodically, to document meticulously, to stay calm under pressure. I had discovered that power was not only held by those with formal authority, but could also be wielded by anyone willing to claim it strategically, patiently, and without fear. There was a clarity in that realization that no cabin, no fine, no procedural loophole could ever erase. As I walked along the shoreline, watching the light reflect off the water in patterns that seemed to dance in celebration of the quiet triumph, I reflected on the ripple effects of the battle. Some neighbors were now emboldened, questioning rules that had been previously accepted without thought. Others were cautious, observing the aftermath with a mix of respect and hesitation. And for me, the emotional weight lifted gradually, replaced with a sense of accomplishment and even hope. The fight had been grueling, yes, but it had also illuminated the way forward for anyone who might face similar challenges. Of course, the situation was not perfect. The cabins, though legally distant from my authority, still crowded the edges of the island. I had to adjust routines, finding pockets of privacy where before I had felt entirely unshaken. But the sense of agency, the knowledge that my boundaries were recognized, that my property was protected, was worth every moment of anxiety, every confrontation, every legal battle. Control had been restored where it mattered most, over my home, my land, and my peace of mind. Long-term consequences extended beyond the immediate landscape of the island. The HOA became far more cautious, scrutinizing each move, aware that their actions could be challenged and documented. Meetings were more transparent. Fines were rarely issued without. Personally, the battle left an indelible mark. I had entered it as a homeowner seeking quiet and solitude, but I emerged as an advocate, a figure whose example might encourage others to question authority rather than accept it blindly. Every letter I filed, every legal consultation, every confrontation with the board had reinforced the importance of preparation, diligence, and courage. These were lessons I carried forward not just for myself, but for the community, hoping that my experience could prevent others from enduring the same stress, the same sense of helplessness, and the same creeping anxiety that had once consumed me. Emotionally, the victory brought more than relief, brought clarity. I realized that fear had been the most insidious weapon the HOA wielded. By undermining confidence, by making me question the legality of my own property, they hoped to break me down gradually, leaving me passive, compliant, and isolated. But I had resisted, step by step, document by document. And the result was proof that courage paired with preparation could neutralize even the most entrenched systems of control. That realization carried a profound weight, one that reshaped not only my sense of security, but my perspective on authority, community, and personal power. The lake itself, once a backdrop to conflict, now seemed almost celebratory. Sunlight bounced off the water in streaks of gold and silver, highlighting the edges of the cabins but leaving my own space untouched. It was a reminder that even when boundaries are challenged, clarity and persistence can carve out a zone of peace. The sound of the water lapping against the dock became meditative, the rhythm soothing after months of relentless tension. Nature, in a way, had waited patiently for me to assert my right to tranquility. And now I could finally inhabit it fully. Looking back, I understood that the battle had transformed more than just the physical landscape. It had altered the social and psychological landscape of the community. Transparency, accountability, and fairness became more than words. They became practiced principles. The ripple effect extended to neighbors, to future homeowners, and even to the board members themselves, whose own behavior would now be measured more carefully. It was a subtle but permanent shift, born out of confrontation, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to what was right. And there was a deeper, quieter lesson embedded in the experience: the recognition that property, privacy, and personal peace are not abstract concepts. They are rights that can be defended with vigilance, intelligence, and resolve. The fight had been exhausting, the anxiety profound, and the confrontation intense. But the outcome reaffirmed a simple truth: when you stand firmly for what belongs to you, when you pair courage with preparation, even the most overwhelming institutions can be held accountable. As the weeks turned into months, I found new rhythms in daily life. Kayaking along the quiet edges of the island, tending to the garden, watching sunsets spill across the lake, I felt a renewed connection to the space I had fought for so fiercely. Each moment of calm was a testament to the months of struggle, the legal battles, the confrontations, and the meticulous documentation that had led to this outcome. It was not merely a return to normalcy, it was a victory earned, a sanctuary reclaimed. The broader message resonated beyond my own experience. Others in similar situations, whether facing HOA overreach, neighborhood disputes, or bureaucratic intimidation, could see that resistance was not futile. Careful preparation, persistent documentation, and unwavering commitment to fairness could transform what seemed like an insurmountable obstacle into a clear path to justice. The story was no longer just mine. It became a beacon for anyone who had felt powerless, a reminder that standing up can create lasting change. Asterisk. Finally, as I stood on the dock one evening, watching the gentle waves ripple against the shore, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The fight had tested every facet of patience, determination, and emotional resilience. It had pushed me to the edge of frustration and fear, but it had also revealed an inner strength I had never fully recognized. The HOA had been powerful, relentless, and intimidating, but ultimately, it had underestimated the force of a homeowner armed with evidence, persistence, and courage. The cabins remained, but their shadow no longer threatened my peace. The island, my home, had endured. The community had learned, the HOA had adapted, and I had grown. Standing there, breathing in the crisp air, I realized the ultimate truth. Real power is not in intimidation, in fines, or in rules applied unjustly. It lies in knowing your rights, asserting them decisively, and refusing to be silenced. The battle was over, but the lesson lingered, echoing across the water like the steady rhythm of the waves. Courage matters, preparation matters, and justice is possible when you refuse to give in. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the last golden streaks across the water, I couldn't help but wonder how many others would find the courage to take a stand. And what other communities might be changed by the ripple effect of one homeowner who refused to surrender.